Last time, we launched our game's Steam page. We made a bunch of promotional art and learned a bit more about game marketing. This time, we plan to finish making all of the basic enemies. But then we got sidetracked making something that we thought was cooler. The first thing I got to work on was a new way to spawn and fight the bosses, starting with a new boss indicator bar, because the old one was pretty ugly. The most common feedback from the free version of the game was that people didn't know what they were working towards. So this boss indicator bar is meant to show them when they would get their next upgrades and fight the next boss, so the player knows that they're working towards something. I had recently added a lock to show up before the boss fight for the chaos bar, so I knew where to slot in the code for resetting this new indicator bar. At first, I did the art for this bar, but Art kindly took it away from me and finished it himself.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine.
Then, to further tackle the issue of people feeling confused about where they're supposed to be going in the dungeon and why it's not persistent, we tried to reinforce the fact that the dungeon rooms weren't supposed to be connected to each other by changing the transition. The old transition between rooms confused everybody because you could see one room and you could see the other one, so obviously they were connected. And to try and fix that, what we did was change it so that when you walk through the door, instead of the camera tweening over, now it's going to fade out and fade back in, and you'll just walk into the other room. So it's kind of like teleporting rather than walking through a door. And then as I was testing it out, Art popped in and was like, "Particles! Give me particles!" And so now the game spits out some particles when you walk through the door, to further reinforce that portal image. And while I was doing that, Art, who was dealing with a crippling cookie clicker addiction, started working on some new sprites for the enemies. They got started with the ghost sprite, because that was the last basic enemy we needed for the trailer. And because this was going to be the first enemy you saw in the dungeon, we wanted to make sure that we did it right. Art drew up a dozen different designs, and I kinda just rejected most of them, but we eventually settled on the idea that the ghosts are sheets, because we thought that was funny. So the ghosts are now called linen, and the whole set of ghost enemies will have something to do with laundry. But after the ghost was done being made, I added it to the game, and found a bunch of issues that I wasn't expecting. Like right here for one of the damage effects, instead of having it set to affect all enemies, I had it set to affect just the slime for some reason. And while this one's a minor thing, I'm kind of scared about the next round of playtesting because I'm working pretty quickly and I feel like there's going to be a lot of bugs. The next thing I worked on was the transition to a new boss room, because the old room was the same size as every other room and the fighting would kind of be limited. So instead, now when you walk into the old boss room, there's going to be a teleporter there that takes you to the official boss room, which is going to be 3 to 4 times bigger than the original room. So then we'll have more room to do more things with the bosses. And I started with some prototype squares for the boss room and the teleporter, and waited for Art to make the art. And I asked for something very simple, just a hole in the ground that you'd fall through or something like that. And do you know what I got instead? This. Which doesn't look like a lot, but think about how Z-ordering is going to work with this image. There's lightning going around, fireflies around the pool, and then the portal itself needs to pop up and spawn out, and at all times the player has to be able to be in front of or behind all of these different objects based on where they're standing to, which meant that I needed to cut everything into a bunch of different layers. Which wasn't too bad because Art is getting really good at layering things properly, making it a lot easier for me to do my job. So then with that all set up, I changed the transition from the room to the boss room, so when you go from one room to the next, you zoom into the portal. And for now, that part is functional. The boss spawns in the boss room, but I didn't do anything else with that because boss fights are going to be their own video. Then Art got to work on the first mini-boss. Again, drawing a bunch of designs up first so that we had something to reference, but I started to get worried because at one point we did have a really epic boss being made, but we eventually had to scrap it because it was way over detailed and just huge, which meant that any animations we had to add onto that were just going to take forever to make. And so I got a little worried about the mini bosses. But Art assured me that they learned their lesson with the last boss, and that I could chill and they take care of it. So the mini boss was started. This was going to be the Imp Lord, the mini boss version of the Imp. which originally would shrink and get really aggressive after you killed all of the other imps in the room. But as much as we tried to figure out how that would work with pixel art, because you don't want to shrink it down too much, because then you lose a bunch of detail, we instead decided to go with making them bigger, because that would be much more impressive looking and all that stuff. So they spend the beginning part of the fight small, with a single big AoE attack, and then when you kill all their minion friends, they get enraged. And so now there's an enraged animation where they go from being tiny to getting big. Which was of course a new thing, because before they would shrink and it wasn't an animation change, it was just changing how fast they attacked and some variables behind the character. And so now it was a whole different set of animations between when they're normal and enraged. And I definitely have to give credit where it's due. Art really nailed this one. When it gets enraged, it is definitely menacing. You will likely have a moment of, oh crap, when you see it going from the small version to the big one, when its attack pattern changes and its max health triples. Then there was an issue related to game juice. When you shoot an enemy, you want to see that it's getting hurt. You want to feel like your bullets are actually affecting them. But I made the decision that all of the imps wouldn't have a hurt animation, like all the other enemies do. So they're the only enemy that you can't stun, other than bosses. But you need to have that white flash or color flash to show that you're actually doing something to the enemy. So I tried to tint the character white for a split second when they get shot, but then realized that in GDevelop, white is actually the default color for tint. So applying white to a character doesn't change anything, because white is the starting color. Tinting it would only be affected if I tried to do something like red or blue or yellow or green, which I thought about doing, but then it would be different from all the other enemies and it just wouldn't look very good. So instead I tried going through the effects, and after going through a lot of them, I finally found one that changed its color to white. And so now when you shoot them, the object effect triggers and then gets removed a split second later. Then I tried to find some passable sound effects to use as placeholders for these new attacks and effects. And this is how it turned out. I'm probably going to make an entire video just for sound effects, because it's something that people have pointed out as being an issue. Now that the art is so good, the sound effects don't quite match. Before I talk about the next mini-boss, I need to ask you for a favor. Could you comment down below and tell me what you think of this? We plan to change the game's difficulty, so instead of the enemies gaining more damage and eventually one-shotting you, we're just going to spawn more enemies in each room. They'll still be gaining health, but not damage. So instead of playing the game and eventually getting one shot by something, because their damage had gotten so high, you would walk into a room that's just absurdly filled with enemies, and that would kill you instead. We're hoping this will give players a more satisfying death, because instead of randomly getting one shot, which doesn't feel good, they'll be wading through dozens of enemies in each room, and it will hopefully be more funny than disappointing. So let me know what you think about that new strategy in the comments. Now for the next and final mini-boss, art was definitely running out of steam after the last mini-boss, and we were getting closer to the holidays, so time was getting tight. But they did push through and ended up creating this. Sticking with the linen theme, the ghost boss stays tiny and floats around the scene, invulnerable to attacks, as long as there are ghosts left in the scene. But once all of the ghosts are dead, it takes out its sewing needles and sews itself into a ball, and then when it breaks free, it changes to its enraged form, where the needles are used to create its attack, which will be a giant yarn ball. And the current plan for this enemy is to have it attack like the existing ghost boss, where the big yarn ball attacks will break up into a bunch of smaller attacks when it hits the wall, which means that this enemy will fill up the room pretty quickly with a bunch of bullets that you need to dodge. A huge thank you to my remaining patrons. I took a bit of a break there over the holidays, so thank you for sticking around. And as always, all of the places that I hang out are down below, and if you decide to click on one, then I'll see you there.